Here at the Canadian Club, we have always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas and inform the most relevant and compelling conversations of our time.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
I want to welcome those that are now joining online. We've got about 200 guests joining us online today, and so thank you very much for your online participation. A lot of people ask about the hybrid events post-pandemic. Are they working, are they not? We're sticking with the hybrid model. It's amazing how many people, not just from here in Toronto, but around the world are tuning in online for these events. I'd like to thank our sponsors today at BLG for their generous support of this conversation. We're also grateful to the Canadian Bankers Association for their season-long sponsorship. And I'd like to acknowledge the Canada Forest Trust, whose commitment to acting on climate change has reduced the carbon footprint of our entire season. I'd like to also recognize Air Canada, our official airline, for its generous sponsorships. We're also pleased to see students participating today in this important discussion, thanks to a sponsorship with the Toronto Metropolitan University. We're very glad you're here. I'd like to invite you to use the QA cards on your table if you have a question for our panel today. You'll see them in the middle there. Just write down your question, and folks will be coming around the room to collect them and pass them off to Karen, our moderator for today, who will pose your tough questions to the panel. And now it's time to introduce our panel. So I'd like to welcome Cherie Brandt, partner, BLG. At BLG, Cherie leads the National Indigenous Law Group and is a member of the firm's ESG initiative. She serves as an independent director at Hydro One and is a director with the Canadian Club Toronto. Dave Forrestal, yes, welcome Cherie. And maybe panelists, if you could come up one at a time as I call you. Dave Forrestal, Vice President, External Relations, TC Energy. At TC, Dave has responsibility for Indigenous community and government relations. He served as an advisor to a former Prime Minister, as well as Chief of Staff to the Minister of Natural Resources. Gregory Jack, Strategic Communications and Research at Loyalist Public Affairs. Gregory is a former VP of Public Affairs at Ipsos, where he worked with the Government of Alberta, CAP, and the Government of Canada, as well as Suncor Energy. He served in senior roles in the governments of Canada and Alberta. Welcome Chris Sankey, Principal Owner and President, Blackfish Enterprises. Chris is CEO of Blackfish Enterprises and President of Blackfish Industries Management, a heavy civil construction and management company. Currently, Chris provides advice, direction, and strategic planning to the energy sector on engagement with communities situated on the west coast of British Columbia. He is a member of the Coast Tsimshian community of Lac Quelans near Prince Rupert and a former elected councillor of the Alums Band. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute and was recently appointed as an advisor of the National Organizing Committee of the Canadian Gas Association and International Gas Union. And finally, moderating our discussion is Karen Ruskool.
I should have brought my
Karen's a vice president at Crestview Strategy, and prior to that, she led an environmental consulting firm working with Indigenous communities, building on a prior role supporting First Nations leaders as Director of Justice at Chiefs of Ontario. It's my pleasure to hand over the Canadian Club Toronto podium to Karen and our fellow panelists.
Miigwech Dan, and welcome everyone. Thanks to all of you who made this short trek to join us here at the lovely Fairmont Royal York. I see that it forced everyone to wear button-up shirts and ties. Congratulations. And to the few hundred folks who've joined us virtually, welcome. And although I'm sure you don't have a tie on, I'm sure you'll find the content inspiring. June is National Indigenous History Month. We have here a conversation in and around the future of energy. However, I think we are at a point where we can recognize that Canada isn't moving forward in this industry without Indigenous nations. And so we will be focusing a large part of our discussion here on that theme, and we're very grateful to Cherie and Chris, who are two noted Indigenous leaders in the energy space who have joined us here today and impart with us their knowledge and experience and their vision for the future. In addition to Greg and Dave, who are also, non-Indigenous, but also working in this space and have been partners, leaders in reconciliation as well. So miigwech. All right, let's get into the meat of it. It truly does seem as though everyone is talking about energy, and there's no denying that it's likely the most important discussion of our time. And while a robust focus on clean energy fueled by net zero goals seems to have dominated the political agenda these past years, geopolitical tensions have been cause to reconsider. So we're moving on to our vision. Each of you have been involved in the energy sector in various ways for the majority of your careers. Some of you have grown up in and around it. Let's hear more about your experience and what you see for Canada heading forward. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Before we start, I just have a quick question for Dave.
Sure.
Have you ever wondered why white men went to the moon?
No?
It's because you fuckers thought we had land up there too. Sorry, I had to say F word.
We're getting spicy right off the hop. All right, welcome Chris Sankey to Ontario, to Toronto, all the way from British Columbia.
So now that we got that out of the way, broke a little ice, so I hope you got a laugh at that. Look, listen, when I first got into energy, I knew nothing about it. In fact, I learned all it was forestry and fisheries for us on the coast. And then I started to understand the energy sector as it evolved in the last decade or so. I found that it's in our everyday lives. I mean, each one of you in here today is giving off 1,000 BTUs just by existing, and that's emissions. And without energy, we consume everything every day, from our clothing to medical supplies to our housing to this building. Without it, what do you do? Imagine a world without energy, and then imagine the world with the energy we have today. What could we do better? But for me, it has changed my family. I grew up in poverty. I know what it's like to live in poverty. And the energy sector, the way I see this going is we need you as Indigenous people. We need you as partners so that we could grow our communities to have a stronger economy. Because when you help us, that helps the economy, and you get more people back to work to pay back on more taxes, more infrastructure. So we need your capacity because we only represent 4.3% of the total population. And my vision, or I would hope everybody's vision, is that together we're stronger. If we could form this partnership with you, Canada and Indigenous population could be the next global energy powerhouse. Thank you.
Cherie?
Okay. I don't have a joke.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dave, you're fine.
Don't have a
Rest
joke.
at ease.
I will say it's such a pleasure to be here. My background is Mohawk on my dad's side. I'm from Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. On my mom's side, Ojibwe from Wikwemekong First Nation. If I think about my vision, it makes me think about sort of how I got into this practice. I'm originally a commercial real estate lawyer, and so infrastructure, buildings, I think that's just so cool. And so, obviously that's an area that I wanted to work in. But in truth, the projects that have been happening for Indigenous people have been happening outside their communities. If you sort of think about energy in Ontario, has been a history of projects developed across this country without the permission of Indigenous communities. And that's something that we need to change. We sort of think about, getting to 2050, these next few years need to be different in my mind than the last 20. My vision is that we would have more people in the space. My vision is that we would have a practice where we have Indigenous people represented on all sides of the table. I'd like to get away from the adversarial practice, sort of when I refer to the last 20 years, it's been a grind, right? Sort of working in the duty to consult space has been very difficult. It's always been a fight. I'd like the next several years to not be about fighting, but to be about collaboration, about working together and seeing how we can build this economy. And let's get more cool infrastructure in Indigenous lands.
Love to see it. Hear, hear. Greg, over to you.
Well, thank you, and great introductions. It's kind of follows a lot of what I want to say today, too. I think this is the most important conversation that we can have. I mean, we are talking about an energy transition right now, and we're talking about climate change, but there can be no action on climate change without action on energy. And this is a discussion that Canadians haven't been having. When I was at Ipsos, I did a large global survey of 28 countries, and we found, and we ended up publishing a piece on this, which is called Canada's Inconvenient Truths. And the fact of the matter is, Canadians are not talking about this issue enough. We're here today, we're talking about it. But when we were chatting before we came in here, somebody said it's great that we can all come down to the Royal York and have this discussion, but we also have to talk about it in our communities. It really has to be a discussion about energy, because it is what is driving our economy, and it's what's driving a lot of the things that are happening geopolitically today. So we're going to talk a little bit about that on the panel. But my background, I worked with Dave when I was in the federal government, and I was at Suncor, and at Ipsos, as I said, I did a lot of work for energy companies. So I've kind of looked at it from different perspectives, and I'm doing a master's degree right now of science online in energy policy. So I think it's a very important discussion. I think it's a passionate of mine, and I think that we have to have this discussion. That's why I'm really thrilled and really happy to be part of this panel today.
Very good. Thank you, Greg. Over to you.
Great. So Dave Forstell at TC Energy, formerly TransCanada Pipelines, and maybe just give a bit of context for our business. We operate significant generation and hopefully in the future storage assets, including here in Ontario, significant oil transmission pipelines, and 75% of the gas that reaches Canadian homes and businesses is transported through TC Energy's pipes. So, important to the Canadian economy. And, I guess my kind of story or background here, as Greg said, we worked together in Ottawa and had an opportunity to think about the resource sector kind of at a more macro level, thinking about the public policy environment that encourages investment. And then following that, I worked in mining and was in the north of Chile in some very impoverished communities, and went in with sort of a view and had been told that there was a lot of opposition in the community. And really, I think that stemmed from a lack of working together and creating, maximizing the benefit for those most impacted by the work. And once that started to happen, the mood really changed. And so I guess I'm a big believer in the transformative opportunity that the resource sector can have for Indigenous people, Indigenous nations, remote communities, all Canadians, but also our international allies, and frankly, the world's poor. Like if we don't get energy into international markets, there's no way to escape poverty without energy. So it's vitally important, and I'm just really excited to be participating in this conversation.
Very good. Can we get a warm round of applause? Great introductions, a little bit of sweet, a little bit of spice, a little bit of heads up as to what you can expect for the next 20 to 30 minutes. So, Dave, is it fair to say that our idealistic clean energy strategy here in Canada has been challenging for some more than others? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would say on the one hand, there's a shared ideal and objective to get to net zero 2050. There's aggressive targets for 2030, but I think just a broad recognition across the developed world that the regulatory systems we've established do not allow us to reach those targets for clean energy projects or for any projects, and frankly for major infrastructure projects outside of the energy space. And so I think you're going to see a lot of kind of change to the way that projects, I hope, are both reviewed and permitted. I'd say more broadly, though, like we have to think beyond, when we think clean energy or decarbonization or net zero, we have to think globally about this issue. Like we're also impacted by our own surrounding. If you live in a downtown center, it's frankly pretty rare that you have a long discussion with somebody who works in a hardware store where you're not buying a product from them or getting a perspective of a person who tills a field. And, really, we're just so impacted by our surroundings. And so in Kincardine, where Bruce Nuclear operates, there's really high support for nuclear energy. We closed our coal plants in Ontario, so we don't think a lot about coal as an energy source. In Quebec, they have vast hydro resources, and so I think, they question like, why do we need hydrocarbons at all? But I think, really, and maybe just taking that, like our energy policy is very kind of provincial or sectoral rather than global, although the problem we're trying to solve is global in nature. And I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine really upended that, where instead of people thinking locally, they began to sort of see that as the world quickly had to move off Russian gas, the alternative wasn't just renewables. In fact, last year will be the highest amount of coal burned in human history in a single year, because that was the alternative source. I think people maybe thought the choice was Canadian LNG or renewables, when in fact it was Canadian LNG or Russian gas. And so we've had to confront some hard truths. I think it's also revealed maybe some truths that pre-existed the invasion. 195 coal plants under construction or development today in the world, 90% of them in Asia. When Malaysia first started looking at the west coast of Canada to buy LNG, 7% of their energy came from coal. Today it's 50%. And of course, they're not currently buying LNG, which has 50% of the life cycle emissions that coal has. But also some positive stuff, right? Korea and the EU are recognizing gas as part of the transition in their taxonomy. And I also think, Indigenous proponents and owners in the last decade have really, come forward in a major way, and that's helped change the way Canadians think about energy. Cedar LNG, Indigenous-owned, silisms, again on the West Coast. There's an equity option for our liquefied natural gas transport line, CGL. So I think all that's very positive. And you see sort of Alberta leading the way as well with the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities. So all of this, I think, is positive. And maybe I'd just say, this is a moment for Canada where, despite what we read, actually there's broad public support for the development of our energy resources, including in British Columbia. There's growing Indigenous support and desire to partner. And so maybe I'll conclude by quoting, if I may, Chrystia Freeland, who said, "It's so rare in the life of a country that doing the right thing is also economically advantageous. Right now, LNG is exactly that. We can help our friends support democracy around the world and create some great jobs in Canada." So I agree, and I think it's time to seize the moment.
Very good. Thank you. Very insightful. I did see Chris nodding profusely. I'm sure it's not another joke. What do we think, Chris?
First, I just want to apologize. I wanted to introduce myself in my traditional ways. So my given name is Wadzine, and it means a person that enters quietly. And I'm Gispit-Wada, Gitwell Gyots. Gispit-Wada is blackfish, and so I named my company after blackfish because it had meaning to me. And before I go into what you're going to ask me, Karen, and there was some of the best advice I've ever got was from my late uncle, whose name I now carry on. And he said two things to me. He said, listen, kid, I'm following you. I'm not on social media, but I follow you. I support you. Don't worry about trying to make everybody happy. It's just not going to happen. And the other advice I got, try not to be an asshole all the time. So I took that advice to heart. God bless them. So, sorry, Karen, the question again.
Right, so you've not been shy about your position on the transition to clean energy. We've also heard you talk about the importance of sustainability. So enlighten the room with your vision and insights on how those two can live hand in hand.
Sure, look, there's no secret that sustainable development is on the minds of every Canadian, if in fact around the world. I get that wind farm is going to be part of the national grid. I get that solar panels going to be there. I'm a big proponent of the fossil fuel industry, from nuclear to hydrogen to diesel, cleaner diesel, oil, gas, all of that. And one of the things I found in my travels and where I go, the only difference between Fort McMurray and Interior and the coast is a lot of the Indigenous population aren't talking to one another. And I found that energy literacy is sorely missing, not just within our communities, but across the country, of what is diesel, what is hydrogen, what are all of these fuels that we consume every day. And I think it is so important that we bring experts into the room to talk about it. I've never been one to shy away from these difficult conversations, because really that's where all the answers are going to be found. We could yell at each other all day long. That's not going to solve anything. I think it's incumbent that this room and everybody here sit down across from one another and have a conversation about energy. Oil and gas aren't going anywhere for a very, very long time. But what do we do? What can we do to make it better? You know, by 2050 and beyond, oil and gas demand is expected to go up, if not the same, if not greater, around the world. So why don't we position ourselves internationally to be that supplier to our allies in partnership with Indigenous communities? So the stuff I've been blessed to be involved in the oil and gas sector is not just the oil and gas sector itself. A lot of people know that a lot of this technology is being developed within the industry called the catalytic technology. And it's going to, I personally and professionally believe it's going to revolutionize the pipeline industry. It's going to reduce emissions, which that's all we want to do. It's going to eliminate dilbit in the oil sector. There's a potential to clean up and eliminate the tailing ponds. And it reduces 30% emissions of an LNG facility right off the bat. So this is the stuff you don't get to hear of the information that I've been so blessed to be a part of these incredible minds right here in Canada. And energy, you could have energy poverty, which we don't want. And I think that anybody, you don't have to be Indigenous or not, I don't think it's not fun watching people live in poverty. So if you take that opportunity away from us, when we're finally at the table, you're just going to revert us right back to dependent on the INAC system. And it's just never going to work. I've grew up in poverty. I understand the socialist side. And I get that we are predominantly, I find that Canadians are a centrist voting base. But I think people in the big cities don't see what we see on the ground from policy development at the higher level. I don't think you understand how difficult and how hard it is for us to accept that when we're the ones that have to live with it. And if we're not a part of the policy development, Indigenous people will continue to fight because they're not a part of the conversation when it comes to policy. They're part of the conversation after policy is implemented. And I wouldn't do that anymore because it has never worked since INAC came into inception. It has never worked when they wanted us to be a different race. It has never worked when we had to wait for a paycheck to feed our families. It has never worked to collect welfare. So why would we continue to rely on this. I'm not saying government's all bad, but in partnering with Indigenous communities, we could have a very strong economy for everyone. And in particular, I would like to see more people, which I'm witnessing with the TC project and LNGC. Like we had $36 billion walk out the door on us. We had a $2.4 billion impact benefits agreement, $1 billion in direct award fair market value bid, $650,000 in training to employment for trades, $1 million for academia if you wanted to become a lawyer. But what a lot of people didn't know, when P&W left, they didn't know we lost one of the largest car manufacturing plants that wanted to come to Canada, which was from China to manufacture in the Prince Rupert area. We are close to the Asian market, Southeast Asia. I'm very blessed to know a lot of these guys that I've dealt with through that whole process. They're now all in upstream and the heads of their major corporations over in Malaysia. But at the end of the day, my focus isn't just about getting clean products. So one or two things, like I want to help clean up the energy industry. That's where you're going to win all these wins for reducing the reduction of our carbon footprint. I want to be able to help move things forward responsibly. I grew up on the coast. I grew up fishing. I grew up in forestry. I don't want to damage it. I don't think there's a living human being on this planet that wants to destroy the earth on half of development. I don't know anyone that would want to do that. No, I don't certainly want to do it. So let's be smart about it. Let's move forward together and put in a plan. And that plan is partnering with Indigenous communities to put together the EA process in the policy development from the ground up. And then the other part of the plan to that is, if you could get alignment, which I'm tasked to do right now, to alignment with First Nation communities, and let's call it an economic corridor. If you could do that, which we seem to be winning that, you de-risk the project and you get investment to come to the table. And on the flip side of that, so there's three things that come out of that. One, you get community support. Two, you've identified an industrial area. And three, you got alignment. And the most important piece, I should say the next piece of that is investment in industry. Now, if you don't do that, I can tell you right now, wholeheartedly, there is international money waiting to cash in on that check. My perspective is that why don't we make it Canadian-made, Canadian-born, Canadian-financed? Because I'm telling you, you all know this, you're in right in the center of the money game, that international communities are ready to write a check to partner with us. And there are projects moving forward as we speak in the oil and gas industry. So my message to you out here is that don't forget about us out in the West, because if we could work together, we just strengthen our economy. I mean, we have to. Energy security should be front and center in everybody's mind, energy and food security. Without energy, you can't have food security. So the way I relate this to our people is that if I want to go out and go get fish for my family, I need to fuel the boat. I need to pay for it. Everything about the boat requires minerals. Everything about trying to catch a fish requires fuel. In today's day and age, we have chainsaws. We have all these things that we could do to make things better. Because without technology, in partnership with Indigenous and the stakeholders, industry, there'll be no project. And the only time we are against a project is if we're not a part of it. So let's sit down, have a discussion, and then let's move forward together as a country, because again, I will keep repeating it, together we are stronger. Thank you.
Miigwech, Chris. Did anyone else catch that Chris reference to the chainsaw as a useful piece of technology? I certainly caught that, and I don't think anyone disagreeing with you. Time for advancements. I appreciate your point on the policy framework. There's a lot of talk. I think at this point, Canada knows that we need to move away from the Indian Act, but there's a lot of questions as to what that looks like. And there are people out there who are tabling some ideas. I'm always inspired by the James Bay Cree Agreement that provided an agreement with the people, the Crees of James Bay in that region, with the chance, the opportunity to govern their own people, to govern their nation through that agreement. They got out from the Indian Act in doing so. There are other nations across the country. I think of the New Chalnut Treaty out in West Coast, as well as others, and also self-government talks and agreements that are being discussed and finalized across the territories up north. So thought I'd share that little bit of insight. I don't know that gets a lot of attention, but ideally what would be nice for the more, they call them historic treaties, like the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, where my community sits, to be able to sit down and negotiate modernizing these treaties so that we too can engage in self-government and pave a pathway forward for our kids and next generations to come. So Cherie, I saw you nodding. I know you have insights to share.
Yeah, no, you know what, you raised a lot of points there, Chris, so thank you. I wanted to pick up a little bit on a little bit of what you were saying around policy. I mean, I think it's a double-sided topic, right? Some people can identify with some policies have actually led to all sorts of incredible opportunities for Indigenous people, for industry. But you know, we either have policy or we have laws, right? And if I sort of look on the legal side, with the duty to consult work that's happened, I don't think I've seen the changes that have happened within, you know, Canada as a whole move any faster than through policy, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work, through all of the reconciliation-based activities. Those are policy-based decisions where you have willing partners coming together and saying, let's do this. It's not a law, it's not a decision, right? And so I think it's a double, you know, it cuts both ways, right? But I'm very mindful that each province is different, and we sort of have that piece to tackle with. So when we think about, you know, what's happened in Ontario, I think we can look at a ton of great things that have happened for Ontario. On the procurement side, think of all sorts of First Nation communities that have been able to participate in the economy, and for them, they are focused on economic sustainability. I can't generalize, but it would definitely be more on the economic side before it's on the environmental sustainability side. It's about how are we going to put own source revenues to the nations to then allow them to focus on their own institutions and development of their own capacity building around environmental knowledge. So there's obviously a lot, and it all relates together. But each province is different, right? We have, you know, Alberta's quite different than Ontario, right? We're all subject to the common law at the end of the day, though. And so I think, you know, we see governments still uncertain in how they're navigating through the duty to consult processes. And this is obviously a place that, you know, we like to advise in and assist, you know, both industry and on the First Nation side. But it's really just trying to help everybody get to better decisions, and let's spend more time on doing the deals than fighting about the deals. I don't have the energy for it anymore, and I think it's actually preventing us as Indigenous people from building our own knowledge on the environmental side. So I think there's going to be a time that's going to come when we will be tasked to explain what are your substantive impacts relating to a project that is located within traditional territories. And we have to answer that question. We have to be able to point to our traditional knowledges, to our interests. How do we want to use the land? How do we want to be involved in those lands? And if we can't answer that question, I think we're going to lose the momentum that we have. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to move forward and focus on those ideas.
I agree. Cherie, there's a lot of talk about partnership, and we know that in particular there's a lot of talk about partnership on major projects across the country. Just, you know, briefly walk us down that line. It's not really a brief conversation. Could probably have a whole panel on that alone, but share your insights with the room.
Yeah, so I'll just share with you some little things that come to mind. I think for each community, they obviously want to do their own deal, right? I think if each community could point to their own transactions and say, we have done this, we've worked with this partner, or we work with this and this and this, you know. Each community would like to be in that place because it represents their own healing, it represents their own journey, it represents their own success. I don't think that's actually a sustainable proposition. We actually have to think about how, as Indigenous communities, we can work together. And so it's, where are those collective transactions? Where are those places where we can actually aggregate, collect, form the same ideas and say, yeah, we are part of the same treaty, and yes, we are going to work together. Or yes, we're part of a, you know, certain area within Ontario or different parts of the provinces. But we have to be able to work together and do these transactions, because we just keep hearing on the province side, on the Fed side, why can't you guys all get together? Like, why can't we just do one big deal, right? So I think that's a reality, that's a humanity, that's a human-based instinct. And so for us, we should be thinking about how can we do more transactions as partners, as collaborators, and make sure that our interests are protected. So thinking of major projects, I still think to the Hydro One transaction that we did. We brought 129 First Nations all under one roof for what will be a $1 billion fund over the next 20 years, right? Those projects cannot be done, cannot get over the line without support. And so, so what are the ingredients, right? We absolutely need equity financing. We absolutely need equity support. We absolutely need banks to start to think more creatively about how can we bring multiple assets under one roof, right? How can we, in Ontario, we have dozens and dozens of projects that have been funded under the FIT program. They're all going to get to their year 20. How are these what's going to be the next 20 years? And how can we enter into cross-collateralizations and, do these projects for the next 20 years, right? So that type of major project development will happen. It has to happen. And what it absolutely means is it needs sophisticated work. We're seeing the work getting more complicated.
Absolutely.
I can keep going, I'm sorry.
So Dave's going to add a few thoughts here, and then we'll go over to Gregory to hear about what Canadians are thinking of this. Dave? Yeah,
I would just say I think, we're very excited by the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, essentially putting $1 billion and I think Premier Smith committed to an additional $1 billion in the last election, a balance sheet to work, to basically backstop the loan that First Nations Indigenous communities take on to buy parts of major projects and operations, cash flowing operations that create, multi-decade own source revenue for Indigenous communities, but also put them at the table as owners, not merely as participants or contractors, though that is important too. There's clearly a federal role here. I mean, the operation of the Indian Act is part of what denies the ability to have security for First Nations communities in the first place. I think the federal government has taken some really good steps through the Canada Infrastructure Bank, but they've limited the eligibility of projects. And again, from our perspective anyway, if a chief and council have said this project, this operation is appropriate for our nation, then why are we second guessing that? And so I think our view is, more balance sheet needs to be put to work to, exactly as Cherie said, finance these, important ownership participation and change the dynamic from participants to owners who sit at the owner's table and think about capital expansion in the same way that an owner thinks about capital expansion, which doesn't remove Section 35 rights, which doesn't impact the ability to participate in the environmental review process, but answers a key foundational question, which is, how do I benefit from this thing which is taking place in my land? And I think that when we address that and do a better job of solving that, many of the kind of fights of the past will start to fade away, I hope.
Absolutely. Gregory, what are Canadians thinking when it comes to the energy sector? And is it helping us or hindering us in moving ahead as a nation?
Well, I think, and Chris and Sherry brought up some really good points around literacy, and the fact that most Canadians couldn't tell you where they get their energy. They're sort of generally aware that oil makes gasoline, I suppose. In Quebec, we certainly know that our energy comes from Hydro One, or Quebec Hydro. But the level of literacy that Canadians have about the energy sources that they have access to, and that what fuels Canada's economy, is very low. And you don't see that in other countries that are similar. You don't see that in Norway. You don't see that in Australia, where they've had a discussion about how to develop those resources. And hearing from everybody today, really it's about economic development and empowerment and reconciliation as an idea that reconciliation with Indigenous communities, not as token measures and not as stakeholder consultation, but as partnership, as equity partnership. But in order for some of that to move forward, we actually have to have the discussion as a country about energy and what we want to do. And the question on climate change comes down to more than simply reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or a move to clean energy sources. Right now, especially with the war in Ukraine and coming out of COVID, we're seeing a lot of focus on reshoring. We're seeing a lot of countries who are saying we want to have access to our own energy resources. Canada has a tremendous opportunity to both be a safe and clear supplier of ethically produced energy, and bringing the Indigenous communities in, we can be world leaders in that as well. There's an energy justice question here on two levels, really. The first one is sort of restorative justice, or making up for past wrongs, and the opportunity to do that with Indigenous communities is there on the energy file. But the other one is, equality of opportunity. And it really is puzzling that Canadians aren't thinking about how much we are squandering by not having this discussion and thinking about energy as a whole. The German chancellor came over to visit the Prime Minister last summer and essentially was saying we could use some LNG. And the Prime Minister said, well, we're going to make you green hydrogen. And that's great. That's wonderful. If we can make green hydrogen and ship it over, I'm sure that it'll be a really useful source of energy. But right now, the world needs certain types of energy. And as I think Dave said, what happened when Russian oil and natural gas was displaced, it was displaced by coal. It wasn't displaced by Canadian natural gas. And a lot of people might say, well, natural gas is emitting, it shouldn't be part of the future energy mix. And that's a discussion that can certainly be had, but it is part of the current energy mix. And in order for us to take advantage of our opportunity economically, to have proper reconciliation with Indigenous people, and really to contribute to the post-COVID, post-invasion of Ukraine world, we have to have that discussion. And I don't believe Canadians are tuned into this or thinking about it to the extent that I think they really need to be, because it is a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous risk for us if we don't start to engage.
Very good, thank you. So we are near end. I'm getting the code here from Colleen. We had about 2 more rounds to go on questions. As these things go, you always run out of time. And as you can tell with the insights here, we could probably spend a whole afternoon together. I do want to get to at least one audience question. I think I have about 15 cue cards here. So there's definitely interest on this topic. Maybe we host another conversation in the fall on this very point. I think there's a lot of a thirst and hunger to dive into this. So we'll start with Chris, and we'll go down the line for some closing comments, concluding thoughts. There is one question. You can choose to take it or not. Someone's quite keen. What does Canada need to do to actually get a pipeline built? So speaker's choice. Either you go with that one or you provide the room with some insights of your own. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, sure. Alignment. Anybody that follows me or knows what I do, I never ever talked about a project, and still haven't. Soon. If you could get alignment with First Nations along that pipeline corridor, or the energy corridor, we call it, you're going to de-risk the project. Failure to do that, you'll run into all sorts of roadblocks. It's just reality, because we're tired of being beggars in our own land. This is about intergenerational wealth transfer. Instead of managing poverty, we want to manage wealth for the next 7 generations, and coupled with our knowledge, and that's happening. I think it's quite indicative to understand what's happening out in the West versus what's happening out here. And you're right, you've all hit on it. It changes, the landscape changes. There's one thing that's for certain, it's that engagement early and meaningful engagement is what's going to get the pipeline built. And the alignment, de-risks so business and investment come to the table and invest with us. And there's a lot of opportunity, and I think today my message is, let's be on the right side of history. You know, I'll leave you with this. When my time comes, I want my kids to know that their dad was on the right side of history, that I was there to help our people and Canadians abroad to do the right thing. And we need money to do that. And we need energy, and we need sole source revenues. And together, we're stronger.
Very good. Gregory?
Same question, or?
Yeah, speaker's choice.
Well, you know, I mean, we have a tremendous difficulty in this country getting anything built recently. Infrastructure, critical infrastructure is another conversation we have to have. But I think that this is a really wicked problem, because the pipeline became essentially, and I'm thinking about KXL, Dave, but all the pipelines, Gateway and that, became a bit of a symbol for whatever cause you wanted it to be a symbol for. So it was a proxy for climate action, or it was a proxy for Indigenous rights, or it was a proxy for somebody who basically didn't want us to be using fossil fuels at all. It wasn't never really about the pipeline only. And now, you know, I go back to my earlier point. There was general awareness of Keystone among Canadians, but you know, this is a debate that played out in the media for years. I remember when I was on the Beyond the Border working group, and Prime Minister goes down to the United States and makes an announcement with the President about this new perimeter security and economic development partnership between Canada and the U.S. First question he gets, what about Keystone? And that was, of course, the day that Obama announced that I think he was not going to permit it. And this was, you know, well over 10 years ago, and the debate is still going on. So, you know, but having said that, Canadians are generally not really aware of these things. And having that discussion about energy has to include a discussion about pipelines, what they really are and what the alternatives are, what the trade-offs are. Because I think that what's happened is that some of the opponents to these things, and not just pipelines, but some of the opponents to a lot of energy, have a disproportionate voice in the media that sounds like they're louder than they really are, because they are taking up a lot of the oxygen and the space, and Canadians are not really thinking about it or talking about it as much as maybe they should be.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. To get pipelines built, I actually joined my law firm to get pipelines built. I had spent 10 years working with First Nations, working with Indigenous communities, and I'm a proud Canadian. I want to be a part of a proud Canada. And so that means, for me, crossing the table, getting on the other side of the table, and breaking down barriers. So I think that governments need help. I think industry needs help. I think that we cannot underestimate what being heard and listened to is all about. That healing process for Indigenous communities is so real, it is so profound, that if we create the space for past grievances to be heard and understood, we will find an incredible sense of growth and healing for everybody through that process. So that's what I want to be a part of, and hope we get there.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know that I could say much better than Chris said what I think needs to be done to get pipelines built. I think, you know, key in that, though, is, you know, currently there is broad public support for oil and gas in Canada. It just doesn't feel like it. You know, we just recently looked at some public opinion research, 70% support in British Columbia for LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink. You would never guess that, you know, sort of looking at the media. 34% strong support versus 9% strong opposition. That's almost 4-1. But, you know, I think really if the people who are the beneficiaries, or who are going to be the beneficiaries are well, let me put it differently. These things work when Indigenous communities, unions, and others benefit from these projects. And so to get pipelines built, resource companies, large companies need to ensure on the front end that people understand how they will benefit from these projects as owners, as participants. And then, you know, we need to actually, as resource companies, step up and participate in this debate in Canada. It will not happen, you know, we are not going to see a favorable sort of resolution or outcome if we're not participants in this discussion, if we're not proud to support the industry in the way that, people on this stage. But, thinking about somebody like Chief Crystal Smith of the Haisla Nation, who I think is probably the most effective advocate for LNG in Canada today, fought for Cedar LNG, made clear how it benefits her people, her nation, and that to me is essential to moving forward. So.
Absolutely. There were a lot of bobbing heads today at lunch. As you can see, we were all up here kind of just going up and down, and I saw some of you participating in that new dance move that we've created. An absolute pleasure to hear from the four of you. I speak for the room, boldly, I suppose, that we're walking away smarter and perhaps more motivated to be part of the solution. We see opportunities, we're eager to take partnership, and we're looking forward together. Miigwech, everyone. Thank you.
Miigwech.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. We really appreciate all the insights and the thoughts shared. We don't usually get 15 question cards up for the Q&A period, so there's clearly a demand for this kind of conversation in the country, and it's timely, it's pressing, it's uncomfortable at times, like we all felt for Dave at the start. And I think it's one we need to keep having. Let me just quickly wrap up here, everyone, and say a special thanks to Karen for organizing today's event, bringing together this fantastic panel. That was wonderful. The Canadian Club Toronto has its final in-person event of our season next Tuesday, June 13th. The President and CEO of Purolator Canada, John Ferguson, will be here to speak about supply chain issues in these challenging times. Visit us online at canadianclub.org to learn more about our events or purchase tickets for upcoming. And a final thank you to our fantastic sponsors at BLG for being such great supporters of the club and the conversations we're having. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day. Avoid the zombies.